Audio is rolling.
Don't you need to... Why don't I do it? Because that way you can see it.
Yeah.
On the on the frame.
Yeah, I have to be able to see. Okay.
Okay, ready?
Perfect. Go. Okay, so start out by telling us about yourself and where it all began.
So my name's Luke McKenzie. I'm 30 years old, and I have been into clocks since I was 2, so I've been into it for 28 years now. It started when or at least the family says it started when my mom showed me a pocket watch that my great-grandfather owned. And apparently I was smitten. And since then, the first shot of me on our home movies is me sitting in a stroller asking whether the person with the camera has a watch on. So I was taken. And so I would get them from garage sales and tear them apart, and I would ask my dad to take pictures of them anywhere we went. So I've got photo books full of just random clocks, just wherever. And so I kind of did that on my own until high school, when I took one to a clock shop and asked them to clean it, because I didn't have the tools to do that. And they ended up offering me a job. So that was my high school job, was to work in a clock shop. And so from there, I've just sort of collected what I've been interested in. I've never really given a whole lot of thought, at least in the early days, I didn't give a lot of thought to the criteria for what I was collecting. I kind of just collected what was handy, what I could find at garage sales and stuff. And so consequently, most of what I own is kind of sort of 20th century stuff. I think the oldest one I have is from 1870. So my collection's not that old, but...
Yeah, of course, the 18th, that was practically yesterday.
Yeah, it's just ages. Well, it goes back for, centuries.
Definitely.
And yet, we've seen so much transformation in the 20th century, the last 100 years, in the way at least household clocks are made. And so what I own kind of runs the gamut of the different kinds of clocks that you can have, because sort of the big major change that happened over the 20th century was that we moved from mechanical timekeeping to electronic timekeeping. And in particular, as far as household clocks like these are concerned, we went from mechanical sources of power, which are like coiled springs and weights and things like that, to electric or electronic sources of power, which would be like the alternating current that comes out of the plug in the wall, or direct current, which is batteries. And then we also shifted the way we do timekeeping from mechanical timekeepers like pendulums and balance wheels and things like that to electric timekeepers, which would be the frequency of the alternating current that the power company supplies, or a quartz crystal. And what's really interesting to me, or at least I've kind of found that the pieces I tend to collect are of this type, those two paradigm shifts happened about 20 or 30 years apart. So you have this period from the late 50s to the early 70s, after which we had the battery commonly, and before which we had quartz. And so there's this kind of transitional period where clockmakers were trying to find some way to reconcile electronic power with a mechanical regulator of some kind. And I just find those so interesting, because they're these little Rube Goldberg machines. I mean, clocks are interesting anyway, but to someone like me that kind of has seen a lot of different types of them, there's just some really interesting designs that came out of those 20 years. Probably the most famous one, as pitched on Mad Men, is the famous Bulova Accutron, which I happen to be wearing one of. And it's the famous tuning fork watch, where a brilliant Swiss engineer that worked for... Oh, it's a toilet from next door.
Oh, let's wait just a minute while that happens, because it's pretty loud.
Yeah. This is the point where you can cut away to the...
Exactly. We'll do plenty of things. Question.
Yeah.
Do you have the home footage of you asking the cameraman what...
Oh, totally. Yeah.
Because we absolutely need to use that.
Yeah. I think it's actually...
right there?
Right here, which is not intentional at all, but there it is.
Oh, perfect.
Mackenzie Home Movies 1, 1988. There it is.
Oh, man.
So I'll pop that in and we can watch it.
That's gold. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I have on the Bulova Accutron, which is the famous tuning fork watch. And the idea behind that was a brilliant Swiss engineer working for Bulova called Max Hetzel, his bosses in the 50s asked him to come up with a solution for an electronic watch. And previously, various companies had essentially stuck a battery onto their existing movements and kind of made it work, but they didn't keep time any better. And Max was interested in finding something that would really push the paradigm, push the envelope, and come up with something radically different. And it being the late 50s, he had just heard about the invention of the transistor, which for this purpose is essentially a switch that you can switch using electricity. So you can use it to build a circuit that kind of governs itself. And so he used it to have a battery make a tuning fork vibrate. And so these watches have a tuning fork that vibrates at 360 hertz, 360 times a second, which is somewhere between F and an F sharp above middle C. And they have a tiny ratchet on the side of one of the tines, and they just push the hand around. So when you hold it up to your ear and you hear it, it's humming at that F sharp tone. But what you're actually hearing is technically it's ticking 360 times a second. And I just think that's really interesting because you can't buy anything like that today because these were designs that were born out of necessity. And today, we've managed to make quartz clocks and watches that are really inexpensive and yet really reliable. It's a triumph of engineering, but it's just not as interesting to me.
Absolutely. So if you held that up to the microphone, you could hear it buzzing, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Can you hear that?
Yeah, you can. Hold it just a little closer. Yeah, you can hear it. It's very faint.
Yeah.
But it's just a slight buzzing.
Yeah, and it's pretty soft.
Yeah, definitely. We can even maybe later we can try to get like a nicer recording of it.
And one of my favorite factoids about this is the men's version, but they also made a ladies' version in the late 60s, early 70s, the Model 221. And the tuning fork in that one actually vibrates at 440 hertz. So really? If you know a lady who is a musician, get them a vintage ladies Accutron. They'll have Concert A on their wrist all the time. So I think that's pretty cool.
That is amazing. That's awesome.
Yep. So what else can I talk about?
I don't know. That was good. All of that stuff was really good, and it's looking really amazing.
Cool.
I'm really worried that my phone buzzed in the middle of you talking about the tune. I know that my phone buzzed, but I'm afraid the mic picked it up.
You can fix that in post.
Yeah. So, would you say then that maybe you're interested in clocks, or clocks are something that are interesting because they're sort of like small Polaroid pictures of different decades of engineering?
That is definitely true. I mean, that would only be a small aspect. And I've tried. I've had people ask me, why do you find these interesting? It's a really difficult question to answer, and the best answer I've come up with is that they sort of bring together a whole lot of different disciplines that are interesting. So there's music, there's math, there's product design, there's industrial design, there's graphic design, there's artistry, and all of that sort of comes together to make this object that is both aesthetically interesting but also practically interesting because it gives you information. It's one of the earliest forms of information design, and it's still used for information design today. And you do see it's easy to look at, if you know about clocks, it's easy to look at one and say, oh, that's from 1880 or that's from 1940, because they have these hallmarks, both in terms of the way they're made, the way they're designed, the innovations that have come along, but also in terms of case design, graphic design. It all factors into a sense of the age of the clock. It's a lot like architecture in that sense.
Yeah. So when you're looking to add to your collection, it's not just, I assume part of it is the aesthetics. Does this clock or this watch look cool? Is it something that I like? But at the same time, it's also, you're interested in it from an engineering aspect.
Yes.
Like you have the tuning fork watch.
Yeah, and I try, I'm starting to move away from